Hello, puppies and kittens. I got an email from somebody from Believe in Jesus Ministries asking if I would be open to having a conversation with a creationist, which is kind of what I do. So sure thing. And so I'm joined by a handful of people. I'm not sure what organization or group of organizations they all represent. So please introduce yourselves.
Okay, I can start. My name is Ninkla from Norway, 26. And I'm afraid I'm possibly going to be a bit of a third wheel here. Again, as I mentioned before you went live, I thought this was going to be like a different format, so to speak, like just a conversational part of a show. So a bit of confusion there with Michael, so I'm going to try not to be in the way.
Well, that was kind of my impression too, that we were going to be having a discussion. Does somebody else have a different plan?
No, yeah, discussion is kind of what I was thinking too. Okay.
And Rise Again?
Yeah, I'm Rise Again from the US. I'm I guess kind of I can kind of conceptualize both sides of the argument in terms of creationism as well as evolution, and so that's where I would come from. I think that they can fit together as theories. So, but I mean, I wouldn't necessarily assert a claim on one or the other. But yeah.
Okay, fitting together I don't think is possible, but given the definition of, I mean, there are some people who think that they're creationists if they believe in God at all and believe that God created anything. Mm-hmm. But creationism, by definition, specifically objects to evolution in some capacity, whether it's all of it or just what they call macroevolution, and that's not what macroevolution is, but we'll get into that later. So you have to reject evolution specifically, and probably methodological naturalism in general in order to be creationist, so that they offer an alternative to the scientific explanation.
Yeah, so I would agree with that you'd have to, if you were to make a claim for one, reject the other. But I'm not making either, is what I'm saying.
Okay. All right, and Michael?
Okay, so yes, I'm open to evolution. I'm open to God making evolution happen. I'm open to evolution not even being true.
Okay. So how do you want to begin?
Rise, do you want to maybe start it off? Rise, are you there?
Rise Again?
So, yeah, I don't know, maybe if one of you or Ninglau wants to spell out evolution, that theory, because I think that both of you would claim that, so it'd be helpful to get that first.
Okay, well, I mean, I could explain evolution, but I don't. If
yeah, I think you could actually explain evolution better than I could. Again, I wasn't aware this was going to go live like this, and
in general, evolution, unless otherwise specified, is always referring to biological evolution, which is summarily defined as descent with inherent genetic modification. It is the way that new breeds of dogs are cultivated from parent stock or ancestral stock, and the same type of diversity has been used and evoked throughout the history of agriculture, and there is a significant evidence that all organisms at every level are interrelated in the same way.
Yeah. Well, and like I mentioned before, I can agree with that logic, and like even macro evolution. I was just looking into like genetically modified organisms, and you can have bacteria that interject DNA into plants. I guess that's how the sweet potato came to be from the potato. It just changed the genetic structure in one generation, and like I mean that would be one example of a complete change in DNA immediately, as opposed to it being an evolutionary thing.
Well, we want to caution again when we're talking about macroevolution. The definition that was laid out by evolutionary biologists when they invented the terms microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution was said to be small-scale evolution within a single breeding population. So the different varieties of dogs and such would be considered microevolution because they're all the same species. And then macroevolution was variation between species that's at or above the species level. So if you accept speciation, then you accept macroevolution. And macroevolution was the large scale for everything beyond that. And there is a difference in the dynamic only in that the parent gene pool, if you have a large breeding population, tends to restrict new varieties. And when you get an isolated population from that out of that, like, you know, secured on some remote island or something like that, then you get an explosion of more diversity because the parent gene pool no longer has that restrictive imposition.
Yeah. So you would say the speciation after a bottlenecking event, is that what you're referring to? Like,
just one of them. There's like four. I think there's still only four categories of speciation, and that's one of the most common.
Yeah, like, look, I don't necessarily think that we can reject the concept of macroevolution on the basis that we don't have, like, even if we don't have any direct evidence specifically for it happening in a specific occurrence, like that's not logically, you know, that doesn't make sense. It would seem to make sense that it's possible in several different situations, and I don't think we can reject the theory of evolution. I think we see it in the world around us consistently. Even in our societies, we see evolution in a more for more of that trait of our communication and ability to communicate. Humans have been able to evolve within ourselves. So it makes sense in terms of the logical thought pattern. I guess in terms of like a creationist argument, the only thing I could say is that if you're going to make the assumption that time and space exist, and you're going to base that, you'd have to base that on a derivative factor. And if that factor were to change, we wouldn't be able to perceive it because it'd be something external to time and space. So if we can't even say that what we're experiencing is, then if that were to change, if something were to alter what's happened, or if that makes sense, then we couldn't necessarily say that creationists and their version of the Bible didn't happen as God wrote it in the Bible. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure exactly what you're trying to say. There's a couple of things I'd like to throw in on that. Some of the evidence for macroevolution includes the direct observance of the emergence of new species in controlled conditions, whether it's in an isolated area in the field, like, again, remote islands are common for this. Also in the lab, there's been a number of speciation events to occur there. And we also have other forms of evidence, like a common argument is that all domestic dogs are descended from wolves, and that's true, but there are dogs that were not wolves, that were never wolves, because we use the word dog is kind of nebulous. We use it generally to describe domestic dogs, but it's actually a larger category. And so there are a number of different species of dogs that are not chemically interfertile. They are so genetically distant they cannot interbreed. One example of that being the African wild painted dog. It can't be interbred with wolves or jackals or any other domestic dog. So that why would there be dogs that their genome is a near perfect match, but it's just different enough as genomes continue to get more different in isolated populations that they can no longer interbreed.
Yeah, no, that like I said, the logical arguments make sense for me for the theory of evolution.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I'd like to throw out there is that completely unrelated to that is the assumption that God wrote the Bible. Clearly not a word of it. Even if there is a God, God didn't write the Bible. That was written by people. And very often I can get apologists to admit that this or that discrepancy or contradiction is because of the human interjection from their own perspective. And every book therein is attributed to some guy, usually anonymous and usually misappropriate or misassigned, because it's not the guy that's named that wrote the thing, or it's a number of people and it's all given under the wrong name, but it's people. Just like every other holy book, it was written by people, and they all claim that their holy books were written by their gods.
Yeah, no, I totally, and I would agree with that. And I think that if you were to look at the Bible as something that conveys a truth, and if you were to assume that God is true, then what's in the Bible it would have to either tell a truth through the fact that there are differentiating flaws in human perceptions of things, and you can aggregate them together to get some sort of an underlying message on how people should act that was trying to be conveyed. Like, for instance, if you take the message of Jesus to be, he's trying to teach people from the Old Testament what those codifications and laws and the message God was conveying to the Israelites, how to take that underlying message and conceptualize it through parables so that then it could be interpreted through various other cultures. So that's why he spoke a lot in metaphor. And so I think that the Bible needs to be seen. You can't necessarily say any interpretation of the Bible is true from your own perspective. You can't assert that. Just like you can't assert that any one part is literal. It can't be something that you should ascribe to be literal from a New Testament perspective, at least. Because if you do that, it's more about the idea that you have to find what is truth in what the Bible is showing you. So is it the truth in the fact that there are divergent texts and that humans made errors here and there, and this compiled in this way, and this is how societies developed this? Or is it in the literal stories, or is it in, do you see what I'm saying? Like, that would be the truth within the Bible, I think. And so I guess, like, I don't think you can take it from a literal historical context, I guess, and prove truth.
It depends on what you mean by truth. For me, it's very simple. I mean, the truth is what the facts are.
Yeah.
And other people are talking about maybe philosophical truths, which are not necessarily what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about that. Yeah, what the facts are. And so basically, you look at the differentiation between the facts and what's actually written in the text, and that differentiation you can use to detect where the understandings and conceptualizations of the message may change and may be different, and why they were different. And then it's through that difference and through those flaws and mistakes, but also through the commonalities, you can understand how it can be translated differently, and just more about kind of just understanding essentially how humans can communicate and how we can operate in the world to maximize our own value. So I think that I don't know. I think that you can take it from that perspective, and you would see truth. And honestly, the truth would have to align with the natural world as well.
Did anybody want to add to that?
So yeah. So Rise. So what about getting back to evolution? Could you possibly explain what your case would be of why it might not be the case? Rise. Maybe I should. So yeah, like so Aaron, what do you think about people like correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't William Lane Craig, does he have the position that God of the Bible made evolution happen? Is that his position?
I'm not certain about that. I haven't studied a lot of William Lane Craig. He lost me when he said that in his book Reasonable Faith, which is an oxymoron, he said that when the people reject belief in Jesus, that it was not because of any understanding of scientific information. It was because something along the lines of we just want to sin. And so that's just a flat out lie. It's not just that's not true of everybody. That's not true of anybody. That's never been true for a single person.
I haven't read any of his stuff. I'm not sure exactly what position he takes. I guess, like I was saying, is like if you take truth to be what is defined as God, and then you're trying to understand, like you use the Bible as a context for that, then what the truth is would be you not acting with sin. And if you're not following the truth and you're acting in a way that is is not a net is a net negative. If you're acting in a way that's going to be a net positive, you wouldn't be sinning. If you act in a way that's a net negative, it would be sinning. You can't necessarily conceptualize every action in your life, what the outcomes are going to be, because you don't know the future, but you can try and gather knowledge and position yourself within the world to maximize your potential. And so I guess what I would say is that, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what he meant by that with the sin thing, but I mean, and I would say that people would technically, the idea of Jesus being man and God, the concept that Jesus is truth, if you're living your life relative to your own perspective in a way that maximizes your value, you would inherently know Jesus in that context. And you would be following Jesus. It's not, I don't necessarily think you can infer definitively from the Bible that you have to, like, the words of the Bible and the literal story of the Bible is necessary to believe in literally in order to get to heaven. I don't think you can necessarily infer that. So, I mean, I'm not sure. I know that doesn't quite address your question. I'm not sure exactly what his position was that you were disputing, though, because I'm not familiar.
So,
did I mispronounce your name when I said Aaron? Is it Aaron?
It's pronounced Aaron.
Okay, so do you want to finish what you were saying, Rise?
Me? Oh, so I mean, I was just asking. I'm not familiar with William Lane Craig and his argument there, but like I just kind of, that's how I would perceive sin and that concept in terms of God and Jesus and what it means to sin and not sin, and what we can prove definitively from the Bible.
Yeah, what my problem is going to be very different than William Lane Craig's issue with this. I mean, I have an issue with not just Christianity, but like all of Abrahamic religion, and generally religion just as it is, when they, and specifically Abrahamic religion, when they want to punish disbelief, and morality ends up being irrelevant, because it doesn't matter how evil you are. Every sin can be forgiven if you but believe, but you have to believe, because if you don't believe, then it doesn't matter how good you are, because the only sin that will not be forgiven is the sin of disbelief. So gullibility then becomes the only criteria for redemption.
Yeah, and I think that's how a lot of religions interpret it. And you look at a lot of interpretations of Christianity that take it that way. And I think the issue is what constitutes belief. Is belief having an actual understanding of what truth is and acting in a way that aligns with it, an actual understanding of the inherent concept of Jesus and the inherent concept of truth and how you should behave and acting in that way relative to you. And is that actual belief? Because if you inherently know and act on something, isn't that better than just verbalizing something or just using your rational mind, which honestly religious people say it's not even your rational mind, it's your faith that matters. So if your faith is what matters, then it would be an inherent knowledge of truth that would be an actual belief in Jesus and God, and be a belief in, so I would say that yes, I understand what you're saying, and I think that it's important that you don't delineate as a human what people should literally interpret and believe, which, as we know, the world is always changing, so you can't really stagnate or create the structure around religion. And it seems to me that that's just a hubris of human nature that consistently you see in the Bible to be criticized, but then yet they do it again and again. And so I think any sort of hierarchy or directive that's instituted by humans is directly contradictory.
I think I understood what you were saying, though. I think you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you live according, I think you were saying that if you live according to what's true, then you're doing good. And if you live according to faith, and if faith is true, then faith is actually real.
Yeah, well, so what I'm saying is, like, regardless of what you're logically believing or seeing or experiencing, if you are inherently knowing and acting in a way that's a net positive, that inherent knowledge would align itself with, whether you call it God's will or truth or whatnot, if you're aligned with that, then you will inherently be knowing and living out God through both faith and, in the exemplification in your life. So, but you wouldn't necessarily be saying this literal construct of what specific laws of a specific religion are. And I also don't think that you can hand down a rule set for everyone to follow when the whole point is that there's infinite derivatives of this message of truth that are going to be relative to the individual.
I guess people would say, how do you know that your truth is truth? I might try to get someone in here who's a creationist though. But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. So I agree with that. Yeah. So I would say that you can't necessarily perceive that from your perspective. And so, I mean, from the Christian perspective, they would say that, that's God, if your ability to infer it in nature is God. But so it's kind of your ability to perceive the acceleration, growth, knowledge, and align yourself with it. And that ability would be would be how you can do that. But you can't. You're constrained. You're constrained by time and space in terms of what you can conceptualize and know. And so the idea that you can know what is telling you how to know, the derivative of knowledge cannot be defined by knowledge. So it's a difficult thing when you're basically treading water and trying to figure out what things are. But I think that we all have to accept that we're in that state, right?
The way that I look at it is that we try not to do anything in absolutes. So we as much as possible, we try to work in probabilities, degrees of certainty, if you will. And for me, if you can't, we often hear people claim, I know for a fact, that whatever they believe is right. But knowledge is demonstrable with measurable accuracy so that you can show what you know. If you can't verify the accuracy of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then you can't actually know what you merely believe.
Yeah, and I guess from the Michael, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh yeah. So I guess from the creationist perspective, if you're operating under the basis that our reality exists, and you believe that there is some sort of a grounding truth to that reality that defines it. If you're saying that God is this truth and that God's what defines things, he can then change what existence is in the context of what we're perceiving and knowing. So if he can change space and time, then really anything could have happened in the Bible because God willed it, because it was truth. Therefore, it happened. So when you're operating under the assumption of logic and a constant, the laws of logic being held constant, then it doesn't make sense. However, when you're operating under the assumption that there's something that defines the laws of logic that is changing, it does make sense. So I think it's just because we can't assert the constant, because we can't assert that constant definitively, that we would run into problems with disproving creationism or intelligent design.
Yeah, I still have a problem in that I can't find any trace of truth in the Bible.
Okay, so Aaron, I was wondering, I have a couple of questions for you, because I talk to creationists every now and again on Discord, for example, and there is this thing they tend to do where, how do I put this? They will try to shift the burden of proof onto me by saying that, you're agnostic about God's existence. That's an indirect form of atheism. Like if you don't assert that God exists or that God created everything, then that constitutes a denial of God's existence. Isn't that like a fallacy or something?
It is. In my book, I put it down as the first foundational falsehood of creationism. The logical fallacy is a false dichotomy that you either have to reject science to believe in God, or you have to reject God to believe in science, which clearly not the case. I mean, most of the champions of evolution have historically been, and some still are, Christians. You know, Christians that are working as scientists. I mean, I in a couple of my videos, I've made lists of, you know, believing scientists and the things that they had to say about why they accept the science as it is, and they still accept their belief in God. They will admit that things like Noah's flood never happened, or that Adam and Eve are impossible, but they find some other way to interpret the scripture. Like Robert T. Bacher is he's a paleontologist. He was one of the guides or whatever that they I forget the experts that were called in for the original Jurassic Park movie. He has 2 Ivy League PhDs, Johns Hopkins and Harvard and Yale. But he's also a Pentecostal preacher, and he maintains that he's a Bible-believing Christian, but he has a different perspective on that. He says that to interpret the Bible literally is to deny its eternal meaning.
What does
Okay.
that mean?
All right, Ninkla, did you have some questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was just asking when you say ignoring or missing its eternal meaning, what do you think he meant by that?
That when you try, there are metaphorical meanings behind a lot of the morals in the fables in the Bible, and to express those as history takes away those metaphors and the value of those metaphors. I mean, like Adam and Eve, for example, there is some value in the story from a number of perspectives. That one of the parables is that you can either remain as you are forever, because remember, there's 2 trees to talk about. There's the tree of eternal life, or there's this tree of knowledge of good and evil. Very obviously, neither one of these were actual wooden trees that you could cut down and build a boat out of. They're talking about the fruit of is the result of actions taken or decisions made. So they can either remain in the garden as they are and live forever unchanged, or they can have an understanding of good and evil. They can develop morality, and then you can, the old adage, you can never go home again. They would no longer be like children. They would have become adults and can't stay in this pristine position anymore. That's one of the values of that story. You know, at least it means something that way.
Right.
And that was the way I interpreted it as a child when I read it. I mean, that we're talking about, it's some kind of eternal truth. There was a moral to it some way, and this way that works. And read as a literal history, it just makes no damn sense.
Yeah, right. Because I didn't read the Bible, like cover to cover, before 2011 when I was like 16 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I also saw that as like a story about growing up, and changing as you grow up. But whenever I try to make that case in front of a bunch of creationists that I know that I've discussed with over the past couple of years on Discord, for example, they always say, "Oh, you're such an idiot, Ninkla. You don't understand anything about the Bible."
Yeah, I hear that a lot, and it's funny that you get the same perspective. And people going into like seminary studies begin to learn the dark side of the construct of the Bible, and they start, and very often, Daniel Dennett said that the way to become atheist was to join seminary. When you learn how the Bible's actually constructed, you can no longer interpret it literally the way that people used to. But then if you don't agree with the prescribed belief, then you're told you don't know anything about it. You actually, in fact, have been studying this for years and know more than most believers do, but you're just dismissed as if you don't know anything.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I'm like as learned about the Bible as for example, you or Matt Dillahunty and so on. I just kind of read it once, but did catch the gist of it. And I remember So I work at the local cultural center in town. I promote events around town, concerts, theatrical productions, workshops, and so on. And on my way back to, shall we say, the office or the what's called again, HQ, I bumped into some Mormons, and I had a few minutes to kill before I had to be back. So they started, doing what they do, and we started talking about, oh yeah, but like Christianity and morals, and we eventually went over on the topic of slavery, and when I told them that the Bible actually do in fact endorse slavery, they were just dumbfounded. Of course, I know the Book of Mormon is a bit different from the Bible. I know they kind of believe a bit different things and stuff, but strictly speaking, it is a Christian denomination, I think. And they didn't try to explain away, like, oh yeah, no, that's not what it meant. They literally had no idea what I was talking about when I mentioned, like, I think it was Exodus 21.
Yeah, I have some experience with Mormons. Much of my family are Mormon, and a common argument is where I'm told that the Bible says this or that, and I say, where does it say that? And they can't show me. They can't show me because it doesn't say that. And then when I say what it does say, they say it doesn't say that, but I can show exactly where it does say that. And when I start opening the book to page to where it is, they run out of the room because they know that it says that. They just don't want to admit that it says that.
Yeah. I remember, man, that they want to know, like, oh, like, what do you do for a living? Like, they want to converse with me and learn about me, so to kind of try to win me over, come on, let's be friends here. And I told them that, oh yeah, that one episode about Mormonism is on South Park. I thought it was super funny, which of course makes fun of Mormonism. And like the one guy was like laughing with me, and oh yeah, I saw that episode. That's hilarious. And the guy next to him was like completely opposite. It was so salty. He almost refused to talk to me.
Okay, and we have a new face in the group, Face of Yah. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Hiya. Yeah, I'm just the token Christian, I guess. Hold to like more or less more of a literal kind of interpretation. But I actually grant what you were saying about the spiritual nature of these stories. But I think that that's also compatible with some like a supernatural creation where you could have a tree, a physical tree, like in the midst of the garden, like it says. But at the same time, that, like as you said, there's a spiritual nature to this as well.
Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian. He's one of the science-educated Christians that I mentioned before, and he says that the Adam and Eve story is impossible because he was the director of the Human Genome Project, and he says that that there was never a time where there was a time when the human population got down to as low as 10,000 people, but that it was never, ever, and could never have been only 2.
Do you know what, what specific data that he's basing that on? I understand that, it's genetic or whatever, but what I mean is specifically, do we know the calculation or, how that data is, understood?
Yes, pretty well.
Conclusion.
Pretty well. I mean, population genetics is what evolution is all about. And in any organism that when you have a bottleneck event, that's where there's very few surviving members of that species, and this is usually where speciation occurs in the population. But it is a population. It's never and can never be just 2 individuals. Cheetahs are an example of an extreme bottleneck where the species was almost entirely wiped out once upon a time. And when you do a genetic test on cheetahs, they've identified that it's very little diversity within the cheetah genome, so much so that their productivity is restricted. Their population was dropped down so much that they're almost inviable as a species. And so it's going to be very difficult for them to recover from having so few people in the population. So having only 2 people in the population renders it entirely impossible. Then you have, the mitochondrial Eve sequence, which is there's a number of mitochondrial Eves depending on how much of the global population at one point that you're trying to identify. And then the Y chromosome atom, and both of these, by a number of methods, go back like 100,000 years or thereabouts, or further. So there's only the metaphoric value of Genesis, and there's a number of other things that, what we mentioned before, that Genesis says that believers don't want to admit that it says, or that it doesn't say things that they say it does. And like one of them is at the very last line of Genesis 3, God says he has to take Adam out of the garden because there's also the fruit of the tree of life there. And that if, and this is important, if Adam were to eat from the fruit of the tree of life, then he would become immortal and would live forever, which of course means that he wasn't immortal already. There's no reason for there to be a fruit of a tree. There's no reason for there to be a tree of eternal life if he already lives forever. So the metaphor, of course, is that there's these two trees you can choose from, but in no sense could there have been two literal trees, both with magic enchanted powers, if you eat their fruit. That and the serpent was never Satan. The Bible doesn't describe the serpent as Satan, doesn't even allow that the serpent could have been Satan. There's a number of contradictions elsewhere in the Bible that show that the snake cannot have been the devil. So that's just a Christian legend that of Talmudic legends where Jews came up with their own selection of legends, and Christianity at one point was writing on the Talmudic or the Jewish legends before they came up with the idea of the serpent being in the garden. Previous to that, the serpent in the garden was believed to be Lilith, who was supposed to be Adam's first wife before Eve. And this was big. This was during the Renaissance. Everybody painted, Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and on the pedestal as you walk into the doors of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Everywhere, all of the classical artists depicted the serpent in the garden as a woman. All of them, everybody. But then the tradition changes, because the Bible never identifies who the serpent is. It's just that people adopt this belief that the serpent was the devil, even though other passages in the Bible show that it can't be.
Out of interest, and sorry for interrupting here, I know that if I don't ask this, theists watching this might very well try to jump on it. So at the top of your head, do you remember any of those contradictions that shows that it couldn't be the devil?
Yes. One of them being when you ask a believer, where does the Bible say that the serpent in the garden was supposed to be Satan? And they go from the first book of the Bible all the way to the last book of the Bible, and they say that Genesis, was it 9? I can't remember, maybe 29. They say that here's this reference to Satan as that old serpent. Yeah, and then read the rest of it, because the rest of the paragraph says that old serpent standing on the beach with 7 heads, because back in the Middle Ages, serpent did not necessarily mean snake. Serpent meant dragon, and a specific type of dragon, not the modern concept of dragon. So dragons had legs, and sometimes they had multiple legs. And so in the story about the serpent, you see that the serpent is cursed to travel on his belly all of the rest of his days. So loses his legs there. And then the serpent in Revelations is standing on the beach and still has legs and 7 heads, which is a detail that you would think that Genesis would have mentioned if there was a 7-headed serpent there. But then there's other issues too, because it says that that Satan, or that serpent, was supposed to be cursed to crawl on his belly all the rest of his days. And then the very first time that Satan is mentioned by name is chronologically after this. And the first thing that they tell us about this is that he's walking. Excuse me, I keep forgetting to turn my phone off. So in the book of Job, you know, a serpent, Satan is walking, and God has to ask, where have you been? You know, where have you been, and that sort of thing. And so they never even had a falling out. So Satan is still working for God. They're buddies. This is chronologically after the whole serpent incident. So that can't have been Satan. Satan's out walking around. It says he's walking. So he's not crawling on his belly all the rest of his days. And it wouldn't make any sense to say that he possessed a snake, and that's where all of our snakes came from. I mean, biologically, snakes are the most successful branch of reptiles there are for all the thousands of species that they've produced. And yeah, we have fossils of snakes that have legs, but what we have for the fossils is that for a long time, snakes lost their front legs first, and then their back legs dwindled later on. So we have a number of species that only have hind legs, and they're tiny. Very, very tiny, diminutive thing. So imagine finding a snake that has itty bitty little back legs, still has toes and everything on it, but it's not fully developed. Why would that be? You know, for generations, it's like that. So, Nincloud, where do you want to go from here? Did you have questions? Where we'll do it?
Yeah, I did. Let's see. First off, this isn't really, this is kind of sidetracking, but this one guy, I don't remember his name for the life of me, but he really wanted me to ask you before I go on with the religious stuff, just so I remember. He wanted me to ask you about the dog you adopted, like this big white one. I don't remember the breed. He was really interested in hearing how that was doing.
Yeah, I'll give a quick aside on that, but it is kind of irrelevant to the topic.
Sorry.
Yeah, my mom shows up at the door and tells me that, she opens the door and says, you got this giant dog in your front yard. And then he just bounded into the house as if he'd already lived here. And because he was so big, I was afraid to have him out wandering the streets, because people freak out when they see a big dog. And so big dogs are more likely to be killed. And so we kept the dog overnight and tried to find its owner, and got in touch with a veterinarian and got it chipped. So I mean, it has a microchip in it. We traced the owner that way, found the owner. Okay, good. That's all taken care of. And then we were notified minutes later that the owner picked up the dog from us and dropped it off at the pound. Apparently the dog had been let out on purpose. They didn't want it back and didn't know that the chip would bring it back to them. So they took it to the pound so that wouldn't happen anymore. When I found out that it was at the pound, I'm like, oh, hell with that. And so there we are at the pound, now paying money to make the dog ours.
Yeah, I forgot. Someone mentioned in Discord the other day that you have like a love for animals or something like that.
Yeah, we have 2 cats. My son has a rat. My wife has a bearded dragon. I have my parrot. And then we have 3 dogs, including the polar bear we just adopted.
That sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, he's disrupted every podcast that I've had since we got him. Oh, there was something else I wanted to throw in about the serpent Satan thing. There was, if you're going from the first book to say that, okay, here it's talking about a serpent, and then at the last book, you're talking about, the Satan is that old serpent. Then you can go back and note that in more or less in the middle, you have Jesus declaring that the Pharisees are all a den of vipers, which are also snakes, and that they are the spawn of Satan. But he's not being literal. He doesn't mean that they are actually snakes, nor that they are devils. Nor that that they are actually literally, satanic. So I mean, these are all parables, and so if Jesus is not saying that they are either Satan nor snakes, then neither is Genesis and neither is Revelations.
No, I think I agree with that interpretation. Basically, in other words, so like the snake is kind of symbolic for the deceiver, the shining one. Who. As you pointed out, like it's an angel who, is prideful.
Well, I would,
right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch to jump to it being an angel. One of them, there's a handful of myths that Genesis is based on, and one of them involved the serpent who could not be tamed, who lived with Lilith in the Hulapu tree. So we have some of the elements. I mean, we have Lilith, who is the first woman in Talmudic legend, and then we have the serpent, of course, and then the tree, and then it's Gilgamesh then, who is walking through the sacred garden, and it's associated with the sacred garden of Inanna. And then just elements of that were borrowed and added with elements of a handful of other myths. Importantly, there was one for Enki, who was one of the Sumerian gods, and he trespassed on the garden of Inanna, which I think was being operated by Ninhursag at that time. And so he starts eating the fruit that was in the garden, and because it's a forbidden garden, then all of the fruit is forbidden. So every fruit he eats is forbidden fruit. And so he has 7 different fruits, I think, and then he's cursed for having eaten these. And so Ninhursag curses him, and then the immortal falls, and now we have the fallen immortal and all of that. But then Ninhursag, or is it Ereshkigal? I could be confusing it, but she gets remorse, and so she wants to forgive him, and so she bears 7 daughters, each one born to cure one of his wounds. And Ninti was the daughter of the rib, for she was born to close the wound to his side. And I remember reading that thinking, gosh, this sounds awfully familiar. What is this talking about? So Ninti is the daughter of the rib. So here's the origin of Eve being the rib character. And then we have another one called Adapa. It's a completely different myth, where Adapa was taken to meet the gods, and Adapa was supposed to be like the first man. And then he's taken to meet the gods, and he's warned that the gods will try to poison him. So do not accept anything that the gods offer you to eat, because they might try to poison him. So the gods didn't offer him poison. In this case, they offered him eternal life. But because he was told to refuse that, that's the reason that humanity is mortal. So that it's a collection of different stories that are all much older than the Genesis version we have now.
I mean, while I can see where you're coming from, these stories are still within like a biblical time frame. Do you know what I mean? So in other words, like, modern, what would you call it? Like a civilization, or, ancient civilization being within, like 6,000 years. That is in like credible histories and stuff. Yeah.
The Genesis version that you're talking about now, the Genesis version that's in the Bible, heralds from around 450 BC, if I remember correctly. And this was supposed to be subsequent to the Jewish exodus out of Babylon. And I believe that part, or that version, is attributed to oh my God, I can't remember his name now. But anyway, regardless, these other stories are 1,000 or 2,000 years older. The story of Noah's Ark, for example, exists in a number of different versions, and the oldest of them is roughly 2,000 years older than the Bible version, and is still another 1,000 years after the fact. Because there was a regional flood, a flood of the Euphrates, or Tigris, and it was noted in documents of the time that there was this one significant flood that flooded out that city entirely, and this one particular person who happened to be on a barge with his livestock, taking them to market, and then he gets washed out into the Red Sea. And that was the Asudra. And so he was using a punting method, so he didn't have any means of navigation. He just has to sit out there in the Red Sea until he floats back in, until he floats back onto land, and then he does his sacrifice and thing, and that's where the Noah's flood comes from. So all of Genesis is relatively recent. And Ezra is the one that I think the scholars generally ascribe the version of Genesis, the compilation of Genesis that we now know as coming from him, based on a half a dozen different legends from earlier.
Mm. So it depends on who you ask, you know what I mean? Like, it's definitely been widely accepted that by many, maybe not by this person who you're talking about, or by other scholars that you're referring to, but not everyone believes that Genesis is like 400 BC. You know what I'm saying? Maybe the manuscript evidence might be harder to go back further than that. But,
yeah, well,
you know,
the problem is that when, yeah, other people believe, but what's the value of other people believe? You know, when I meet Joe Bob in the trailer park and he believes that the Bible is the oldest book ever, what's he basing that on? Somebody told him it's the oldest book. So he doesn't know. He hasn't done any study of it. We know other books that are older. We know other creation myths that are older. One of them, called Enuma Elish, is the oldest creation myth on record, and I think that one dates back to that's from Ashurbanipal's library and dates back to 2200 BC, again, if I remember correctly. And one of the passages, that was where creation was done in not 7 days, but in 7 generations of gods. And the 6th divine generation created man so that man would complete the creation, and the 7th divine generation could rest. And one of the things that are brought in there, and that this might be also coming from the Epic of Atrahasis, because sometimes I get these confused, where I believe the goddess is Mami, M-A-M-I, and she says, let us make people in our image. And so they make 7 figurines for men and 7 figurines for women. And then they sacrifice one of their own gods to anoint all of these other figurines in the blood of this one sacrificed god. And then they breathe into the mouths of each of these figurines the breath of life, which is basically a golem spell in Hebrew magic. And they animate all these golems, which become the first people. And so this is one of the reasons that Genesis 2 doesn't match Genesis 1.
I mean, well, obviously, a lot of people will interpret Genesis 1 and 2 as like retelling from a different angle. Do you know what I mean? Kind of like, you know, you've heard Ken Arvin say it, right? Like a car was going down the road, and it pulled over, and then you have like maybe the tabloid or the the main thing. A car was driving down the road, or you know what I mean? A different kind of the same thing, but just with less detail. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's a mad name,
and things are in a different order.
You on about like trees before man and trees after man in the garden, in the midst of the garden, that kind of thing?
Specifically animals before in the first version, and then animals after. You know, Adam was supposed to be the accumulation, or the penultimate, but in Genesis 2, man is created first, and then all of the animals are created after.
Well,
it's supposed to name
that's
them.
in the Garden of Eden.
It was done as an afterthought.
Go ahead. But I mean, that's the way I read it is like so the earth is filled with life, man is made last. Then in the midst of the garden, he brings forth animals and birds and etc. Trees.
But he has to create them, and Genesis 2 says that he created all the animals.
Well, in the garden, right? So he made the trees that are good to eat in the garden, and made I can't remember the specific wording, but basically, yeah.
So he created new and unique species just for the garden, and so Adam only gets to name the animals in the garden. It doesn't make any mention. Genesis 2 doesn't make any mentions about animals others in other places.
But it's in the garden, right? It's in the context of the garden,
right? So and then God created all the animals, and we are to believe that all the animals consist only in the garden.
Well, no, I'm saying like it basically starts to tell you about the garden. So everything that comes after that point is in that context. You know what I mean? They're in the garden, and he brings forth new life and whatever he does, in front of Adam's eyes. As far as I can understand, Adam gets to see creation coming forth.
Okay, so then he's told that he has to name all the animals, but in fact, all he has to name are the animals that are in the garden.
No. So I would say that he, as far as I can understand, he would have been naming all of the basic kinds in the garden. But I'm just saying that, when it mentions, new life coming forth after Adam, that's literally in the context of the garden, if you see what I'm saying. So man is still the last thing in the line of plant to fish to man. But then in the garden, just like today, how we do today, things can bring, you believe in speciation, you believe that, life can come forth. It just takes longer the way you're looking at it,
Okay, so we in Genesis 1, it creates a plethora of animals, and then ultimately they create man. And then in Genesis 2, to create plants and then man and then all the animals. And how is that?
Well, I mean, I'd have to see the verses that you know. I get where you're coming from. You know, that's what I was trying to say. That's in the context of the garden. That's all I'm sort of saying. You know.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot more problems with Genesis we can get into, but there's an awful lot there.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
I guess in terms of an interpretation of Genesis, I know we're interpreting it here from a very literal perspective. How would you, in terms of denying a more figurative or kind of for Genesis from a more figurative perspective or inferential perspective, would you grant that any credence in the context of what it may show about Christianity or about the Jewish people practicing it or truths of that nature?
Yeah, I was like a lot of people. I was a Christian once upon a time myself, and I was because I was told that this is historic fact and God is a conclusively proven scientific fact. That's actually how it was expressed to me. And so faith was not required. That to deny the existence of God would be just as crazy as to deny whether the United States actually has a president, or is it just somebody they prop up somebody and he's not even really in charge of anything. And so if you were to believe that would be equally insane. And so I was trying to rationalize how can these two things be true at the same time. We've got one thing that we can test and make sense, and then this other thing that you're just supposed to accept because you're told to. And then the problem is when you start to read it. There was a poll. I wish I could remember when the poll was done, but it was among American atheists, and in the United States, most atheists were originally Christian. And so there was a poll asking them, what was the thing that brought you into atheism or that brought you out of religion? And the scientific evidence was actually tertiary. That was like the third most popular answer. The second most popular answer was the hypocrisy of the church. And the number one answer was, I read the Bible. So that
yeah.
Sorry, I'm just curious. Tertiary? What does that mean?
Third.
Oh. Okay.
Well, that's an interesting point, actually. And I've talked to a few other Christians that have switched in terms of what type of Christianity they believe in, and that same thing comes up. And like a lot of explicit interpretations when you're not given reasoning for it totally makes sense that then you come to understand, that I don't have any logical basis for this, and it doesn't correlate with the facts around me. And so I guess more what I was saying about the truth of Genesis is looking at Genesis as something where it tells an inherent message, or provides a more an understanding of humans and their actions on earth. For instance, if you were to take the story, interpret it as Adam and Eve had the free will to operate in the world, but without knowledge, they didn't even know that they should have followed what God told them to do, because why would you do it if there's no right and wrong? And so by eating the apple, they chose away from God. And then in their lives now, because they're separate from God, they're existing in a world where there's entropy and decay. So as things deteriorate, that's what is conceptualized as evil. And as things, correlate, that's what's conceptualized as good. And so, I mean, I guess and I could go into more detail on what I mean by that, but it's more what I'm saying is it possible to interpret the Bible in a conceptual way, and also in a way that may show the flaw of human interpretation? Because if you look at it as an anthropology, over time of the Jewish people, and try to put it into context, what they were focused on in their beliefs at certain points and how that affected their survival, I think you can learn some lessons from that and some truths from that, right? Just about kind of the basis for where our society comes from, and our moral reactions and our understanding and how we apply stuff. And I think the same would be true for other religions and other cultures as well.
Well, you can't be too strict in your interpretation. I mean, you have to gloss over some things, because when you say that now they live in a world of deterioration, they already were. I mean,
Yeah.
the Bible, it opens with, I mean, with the creation of the Garden of Eden, and they are given fruit to have as meat, right? So, I mean, the people who made the story were already eating meat, but now they want to create the division of a pacifistic world where you don't have to kill anything, but you still killing things. If you're eating plants, you still have to eat plants. And one of the things that I ask the literal believers very often is, what happens if Adam had never eaten from the fruit of the tree of life or the fruit of the tree of knowledge? What if he had never eaten anything at all?
Yeah.
What would eventually have happened to him?
Well, that's fair. And I guess what I meant more was like the second law of thermodynamics didn't apply before, whatever initiated like if you look at the Big Bang, right? What initiated that? What would you say would be an explanatory thing for what created matter? Because if matter can't be created or destroyed, would it be a fifth dimensional force or something? Or how would you describe that?
Well, I know that this comes up an awful lot, so it's worth addressing. The Big Bang didn't create anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Material energy is eternal, according to the first law of thermodynamics. Yeah. And cosmologists are now saying that that the Big Bang, whatever there is of the Big Bang, didn't create anything. It just it's changing states, perhaps. And you mentioned a fifth dimension, and so I'm taking in you're taking three spatial dimensions plus time. You're calling time the fourth dimension, and so now a fifth, which would be the fourth spatial dimension. Yeah. So imagine if there was a four-dimensional universe, and then or a four-dimensional case of being, and it passes through three-dimensional space, it would appear as if coming out of nothing, and would eventually fade back into something like nothing. But then there's no way for us to know what that possible catalyst is.
Exactly.
It would be the collision of two cosmic membranes, as the string theorists put it, although I don't put any kind of stock into string theory. It's not. String theory should never be confused with a scientific theory. That's a mathematical theory. They have different rules.
That's fair. Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what I was saying, is you can't even conceptualize it from a temporal or a spatial standard if it's something external to space and time you're discussing. So it's like you're not going like what that would be. And so I guess then that comes down to the point that whatever, if there is something, if that is there, crossing through, and then what would be beyond that? Like there's kind of an infinite vastness of what could and couldn't be. Like our ability to put probability on things kind of goes to zero if we come back from what could actually alter our laws of time and space that we interpret them as. Because if we're going through time at what we perceive to be a constant rate, if how time interacts with space is altered, and if the ratio at which it alters with it is altered, you could end up with, if there was an active force that was coming on that, changing it, you could end up with us perceiving that we have had always this constant time, but it not having been in the past. And so I guess that's the point at which I say, like, I can say up to, if these standards have stayed the same, and we assume the laws of logic as constant, and we assume this all is constant, I can say that I look at something like evolution, and it definitely makes sense as a theory, even though some of the specifics we don't have all the details on. But regarding creationism, I don't think it can necessarily be a rejected idea if it can't be proven, because that's kind of definitively science's negation is important in order to prove it wrong, right? Like, so when you have that ability to alter the past, all these become possibility, right?
No. In order to state whether something is possible, you have to have a precedent or a parallel or a verified phenomenon indicating that such possibility exists. So without that, there's literally no possibility. I'm not saying that it's necessarily impossible, but there's no possibility to look at. So science doesn't prove anything true. There's a rule that science can't prove anything true. We can only disprove things. But there's something that can't be disproven, because there's always an argument, like God, for example. You can't disprove God because God is supposed to have infinite magic power, to hide himself. So if he has infinite magic power to hide himself, and he wants to hide himself so that everybody believes in him on faith, then how do you prove he doesn't exist? Logically,
Okay.
you couldn't, right? But then science can only look at what is supported by evidence and what is not supported, and whatever is not supported is not worth serious consideration. Come back when you have something to show.
Okay.
Yeah,
but what if you can't?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
But no, I'm just saying. But if you can't keep consistent these standards, I'm not even just saying that creationism would be the only thing that happened. We could have several different dimensions of, several different exemplifications of time over spatial patterns that we may just experiencing one of those. There may be an infinite amount of those that you're having that are occurring, but our awareness is bound to this small perception. So my point is that I can see how creationism in this context, in the context of what we can comprehend with our perception, is illogical. That makes complete sense to me. But if we don't understand that we're making an assumption there, it's important to recognize that assumption and the absolute vastness of of what we can't know. There's so much that we don't know from our perspective that we don't even know we don't know. You know, it becomes a point where you can't predict any probability or anything could be and not be, because if the laws of logic weren't, then you couldn't say that, well, this is impossible to happen, because it would be like, and then so you get to the point where it just becomes that there's nothing that we can prove from this relative perspective.
No, I wholly disagree. As I mentioned earlier, though I don't think we were recording yet. This was like in the pre-discussion while we were waiting for everybody. I mentioned that some things, if you give an infinite amount of time, will eventually happen. So if you're going to make a prophecy, you have to put an expiration date on that prophecy, because if it's possible, it's going to happen given an infinite amount of time. But there's some things that are not possible that will never happen no matter how long you wait. So like monkeys will never fly out of my ass in any eventuality. At no point, even over millions of years, will a cow be able to jump over the moon. The tensile strength of the bones, the thrust capability of the muscles versus the weight of the animal versus, the math to come up with the escape trajectory. It's not just that it's highly improbable, it's impossible. The numbers do not add up. So
doesn't that assume somewhat like naturalism? And don't get me wrong, like within a supernatural framework, I'm not saying that I'm going to jump over the moon. I'm just saying that when we say it, it can't be done, we are assuming a certain kind of framework, right? Where we just say, look, based on observation, based on these calculations and naturalism, but we don't, obviously naturalism isn't naturalism.
But wait,
well, I mean, in other words, there is no supernatural anything, right? There is no nothing going on behind the curtains would be the assumption, I guess, right?
That there is reason to believe a supernatural something and define what that supernatural is?
Well, really what I'm saying there's no reason to assume naturalism, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Okay, what does it mean to assume naturalism?
Well, it just means to assume that, you look around, you look at, I don't know, the moon or anything you want to posit, anything, and it just, I suppose you're believing that it had no supernatural causation behind it.
What does it mean to be supernatural?
Well, it'd be beyond nature. So in other words, something that transcends nature, that brings forth what we call the natural world.
Okay, what does that mean?
In other words, made by God. Is that what you mean?
Okay, but I need a definition. Because assuming naturalism, am I assuming that the moon exists? Can we take it as given that the moon exists?
It exists. It's just the origin of it.
Nature exists, right? I don't have to.
Yeah.
Okay, so good. So that part's established. The naturalism, not an assumption. We can test that. We've got the nature works. Nature is real, and now you want to add another element, and you call this supernaturalism. What's that?
Well, really what I'm saying is that the origin of the natural world would be that which is above it. you know, that transcends.
Okay, so then we get up to what Rise was talking about, the endless speculation about things we can't know. I'm not interested in endless speculation about things we can't know. I'm interested in the things we can know.
And that's where I guess my point was, that we're assuming this constant rate that we're moving through and having experience in time, and in this rate you hold constant quantum logic, and you hold constant these mathematical relations, and so we can then make predictions and operate and derive things such as objectivity and science, and we can work logically within that framework. That makes sense. Now, if you were to change this, if you were to alter the ratio, if you were to alter the speed, if you were to alter what time was, if you were to alter the spatial pattern initially, if you were to make any alterations to the definition of this, which we're counting on, because from our perspective, we can't perceive all of the infinite amount that could change about even just this basis of which we're looking at. If we hold this ratio constant, the assumption that we could hold this ratio constant, if we have this here, and we are assuming an existence, meaning that we're assuming we're perceiving these 4 dimensions, meaning that there must be a fifth a definitional dimension by which you could perceive these 4. So, I mean, I'm saying that the derivative property of time and space, if you can't determine what that is, or if that changes in any way, then I really don't think it's rational to say that this can't change. It's just like saying you can't have other solar systems, or you can't have other stars or galaxies out in the sky because I have this one here and we don't have any evidence for it yet. It's an absence of evidence isn't an evidence of absence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've heard that many times, but again, I have to go back to science. Look at what is supported and what is not supported. What is not supported is not worthy of discussion. So there's no point in endless speculation that can neither be indicated nor vindicated, verified, or falsified.
Yeah.
It would not prove. It would not add anything to the sum of human knowledge. So you can't say anything is true until you can show the truth of it.
Yeah,
and until we have some evidence that there is that the things that you're suggesting are true, then there's no reason to discuss them.
Okay, but like again, I mean, like I said, I don't think we could have a logical argument under those other scenarios, because we can only perceive what this one that we're assuming, this existence and relative perspective we're assuming. Now, so we can only really logic within that and do proofs within that. I can understand that. Now, that said, if you're going to say that, I'm just saying that based on just the logic of that, I can't deny the rest of it. I can't deny it from my perspective either. I personally, I have an issue with making assumptions where I can't prove things, because
me too.
Yeah. So
I don't have to assume. If there's no evidence to support a position, then that's it. That's all there is. Is it supported? Yes. Okay, we'll continue. No. All right. Well, come back when we've got support for that.
Yeah. When I talk to theists, for example, and they will ask, "Oh, how do you account for this? How do you account for that?" And I think, well, there probably are a scientific explanation for how this thing works. And I will say, "Oh yeah, so I just looked this up." And for example, if someone asks me, "Oh, how do you count or explain that we can learn stuff?" And I will say, "Oh well, these things happens in the brain when we learn something new." And they will say, "Oh yeah, but how do you know that?" They will say that science, including neuroscience, everything that science possibly can discover is just provisional truths, because it could change if we discover something new, so they aren't worth considering.
Yeah, so then we're talking about probabilities and degrees of confidence rather than absolute statements.
Right.
And so science works with the model that works. I mean, we were probably all taught Dalton's model of the atom in school, even though we know that Dalton's model of the atom is not accurate. They don't throw it out entirely. They don't say that this is false and nobody should learn this. They don't burn the books that Dalton wrote. because Dalton's equations work in a way that the quantum model cannot. We know that the quantum model is more accurate, but when there's no, it doesn't give us a formula that we can do stoichiometry, like Dalton's model does. And I hope I'm not confusing Dalton's model with Bohr's model, which also isn't accurate, but you have to teach that too, because it has its application where it works, where it's useful. So we have to know that these are as they are. And we have to know that our understanding of that is limited, but that there's a practical application for it, because only accurate information has practical application. And then we just know that there's some accuracy to that, even though it's not total. So everything has to be in degrees of confidence or understanding.
Exactly. I don't think I could have put it as elegantly as you just did, but I kind of try to make that point in discussion with theists. And I wouldn't say that that's the case for all theists. That would be a bit naive, but in some cases, people just go like, "Oh yeah, but it's provisional. It's provisional. It's provisional." So they won't accept it anyway.
Yeah. The one that really bothers me is when you start to bring up evidence against an extreme literalist position, and the first reaction is, "Well, how can you know that you know anything?" Or how do you know that you even existed 2 weeks ago? You could be, you could be a brain in a vat and all memories be false, which means that you're telling me that reality is not even real, or that it might be that reality is not real. And the thing that's frustrating about that argument is that if reality is real and these facts can be known, then these are the facts that we know that we can show, and they contest a literal interpretation of the Bible. But if reality is not real, as you're suggesting, then the Bible isn't true then either. So
are you listening, Face? That's a joke. When I talk to Face on Discord, he keeps bringing up solipsism.
Well, wait. No, I mean, so I understand where you're coming from. Like, I do think that in order to have any sort of logical discussion, you have to assume existence, and the properties of that. Now, at that point, in terms of the Bible or basis for things, that's kind of where it would stem back to, because what someone like a theist would say is that the necessary precondition, we had mentioned that fifth dimensional whatever that would have interacted, that is an infinite unknown, that is what God is. And so they'll conceptualize that as God. And they'll say that, okay, this is what God is. The reason that we understand that there is anything there is because we have a perception that we're having at this constant rate through time. So we have a dimension there as well. And so that's allowing us to ground our ability to logic and our ability to experience time. And so that basis, which, I mean, that would just simply mean that we're having an existence in our space, and that still doesn't defy any of the logic of nature. It doesn't specify a Christian God. But from that point, they will say that their knowledge of this ultimate, they then can translate in a way that can't be that can't be done using logic, because their knowledge, their innate knowledge, is not something that they can express through knowledge, because it's what provides them knowledge. So they can cognitively, they're saying that through this special revelation, that they inherently then know and are self-evident from the world around them that the Bible is true, this interpretation of Christianity is true, and they'll reference that in order to provide its truth. Now, that's not necessarily something that can be proven through logic, because the whole point in the Bible is that you had to have it revealed to you, because you could not come to it through logic. So, and this is kind of, I know this is a bit of a long-winded way to say this, but I just want to express the logic of that argument. And I can understand when they make the necessary presupposition that there is that infinite unknown force there that they will describe as God. And I think that probably that there can be an agreement on whether there is existence. But beyond that, the fact is that they say that their knowledge of existence is what provides them with their interpretation of the Bible and its truth. And there's no way to speak to that. And like you were saying, you can't test that space, and you don't really have any interest in discussing what that is or going into details on that unknown, because you can't even test it or talk about it scientifically. So you're kind of at an impasse there. And I guess what Christians would say is, how do you know that, or how do you know that you don't know? Because you can't say what that, if you can't say that, you're experiencing things, how do you know that you don't innately know that and are denying it? This is getting into an area where we can't prove or logic. And so I think it's probably best to stay in the area of logic and deduction when we have discussions like this.
Well, you mentioned earlier about that it's dangerous to assume things without reason. But that's kind of all religion is, isn't it? I mean, we're assuming that there's a God, and we're assuming that this force or whatever that we assume is there, we now assume is God, so we can compile assumptions atop assumptions.
Yeah.
We don't have a reason to believe any of it. And if all of that ultimately is to come up for some defense of the Bible, well, then the definition of God that you just presented is contradicted by the biblical description, which means that if God existed by the definition you gave, if there really was a God, the Bible would still be wrong.
Well, the only issue with that is, like, there's between literal and figurative interpretations, and including its contextual in terms of history application. The Bible itself can be infinitely interpreted. So what exactly is the correct way to interpret this Bible, which is a collection of human written documents that are meant to exemplify what's true? So how do you even interpret that? How can you say whether your assertion is correct or not? How can you speak for God as a human who is supposed to be, who is supposed to have that? Like, how can you speak for God and, like, try and take his, I'd call it taking his name in vain, and proclaiming your version of it, and making that assumption. And it has a lot of hubris to it. And if you actually look at the Bible, it's always human flaws and human failure to interpret God that ends up getting people into trouble. And so I would agree with you that if you were to look at things logically, and you were to assume there's a God, that from the interpretation that you're taking of the Bible, or the literal interpretation, you would not be able to say that it would be true. There would be a contradiction there. But what I would say is that you don't seeing as you can't necessarily speak to alterations in what logic is, because we can't ground them, and seeing as you can't necessarily say whether or not there aren't inherent cultural, anthropological truths of the Bible and things about it that have messages that really transcend cultures, and just coming to understandings of societal development and of the interworkings of human social structures and of how you can align yourself in life, and just trying to get an understanding of how you can maximize yourself in your own environment. That whole concept, I think you can definitely interpret the Bible in, if you wished, a figurative way that wouldn't necessarily contradict, if that makes sense.
Contest that too.
What?
Because I got to contest that too. Because
okay.
I know that people try to interpret by reading between the lines and then ignoring the lines, but I can't ignore the lines. I mean, the Bible isn't just wrong scientifically and historically; it's wrong ethically and morally. It's wrong every way that it can be wrong. Everything the Bible says about the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is wrong. And it's the kind of errors that were shared ubiquitous throughout Europe, throughout Asia at the time, but it's still wrong. Yeah. And so I realize that nobody reads the Bible as literally as an atheist does.
Yeah, yeah. But I think that's actually really fair. That's a really fair point.
There's certain contradictions that I can't get around. When people say that I was watching a children's cartoon, Bible cartoons, and they're depicting how Abraham is talking to God. And so Abraham is looking up and he's talking to a twinkling star. And whenever the star twinkles, that's when you hear the voice of God. But that's not the way the Bible describes it. That's the way Christians want it to believe. But that's not what the Bible describes. What the Bible describes is that Abraham's at home. Shut up, dog. Damn it. Falcor.
That's the polar dog? Or polar bear?
Yeah. And he ruins every recording because he'll hear a dog 2 blocks away and have a conversation with that dog through my wall. It's very frustrating. Can't even be professional anymore. Shut up!
So I actually would say it's that very fact that there are these conflicting facts and that there are these obvious contradictions that go to show you that our derivation of truth always will have contradictory flaws in our understanding, but there are going to be some concepts that we can agree on. Like we both have different interpretations of something, but there are some commonalities there. There are some patterns there, and that's how we can build our societies, right? How we can come to understandings about different facts in science. There are certain things that transcend different experiences and different circumstances if you hold certain variables constant. And in the Bible, you can kind of contextualize this to society. Look at Jewish society, you look at the stories, you look at how they implemented them in their understanding of culture, you look at how their society ended up managing being in different environments in captivity and understanding how they essentially corrupted their own message to the degree to which if someone were to come and were to convey the messages of what they were supposed to be practicing into parables or just convey that message generally the way that other societies could translate that weren't all these specific little laws that you had to do for a specific culture and that weren't just very tailored to one society in one time in one place. If it were an overarching understanding of the message, that they would actually destroy their own person. They would actually kill the very thing showing what their religion should be. And they would then, and the government around would be complicit in allowing it to happen because it's best for everyone in a corrupt system to allow for corruption to continue if it's easier. And then you end up with the story, and as you see that message afterwards, you see it be interpreted in all these different ways that now have new contradictions and now have differences. And now when the Bible's put together, there are different gospels that have differences in them and different times that things were put in. And it's huge, complicated collection of what you could see as errors, contradictions. How could this even be true? And I can totally see where you're coming from on that. But I think that the whole point is that this thing that you came to in the middle from one culture and then you put into another culture, this thing, you're seeing how something that could be a truth is so complex and hard to differentiate from what you have and from one given point, let alone, and even if you have a ton of different points, you can get a better idea when you come together as a society and try to see something, but you can't ever really know that absolute. And so there aren't these absolute arbitrary moral standards and ways of doing things and structures and societies that try to force this set of rules. That's the flaw. And so I guess if you were to look at the Bible, I think that interpreting it from the lens of, okay, well, this is going to show me something about history and at least an idea on how people thought. What can I learn from it? I think that interpreting it even in that way may be beneficial. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so what that interpretation brings me for the Bible is that people were once very, very irrational, illogical, and superstitious.
And still are.
And I would like to think that we're moving past that, but clearly current events have illustrated that that's not the case.
Yeah, and I guess I think that it's not just religion either. I mean, I think people want to believe when they're told things. They want to be able to count on things. And so there's not just belief in religion, it's belief in their friends, it's belief in their, just what they're told, what society tells them, what they feel like they should do. And I think that it's very important to always challenge that, be able to challenge and logic and reason all different possibilities. But I think that, yeah.
Okay, so God then is in some capacity influencing people to write these books about him. And I would have to say that if we're making the assumption that then the various books that men have decided to include or exclude from the Bible, there's a whole list of them, and some of the books that were included in canon refer to other books that were written by people. So we know the whole thing is written by people. And not just the Bible, because we have a number of other books. We have the Bhagavad Gita, which is just one chapter of the Mahabharata. We have the Uransha book. We have the Adi Granth, which is the Sikh religion. And so in the Sikh religion, interestingly, that was, I think, 1400 or so CE, when Guru Nanak, he's praying to God, and he wants to know what is the true path. And God tells him that neither of the two great religions are true, and that there's a middle path of truth between them. And the two great religions that God was talking about were Hinduism and Islam. For whatever reason, Christianity didn't even make the list, because we're talking about Pakistan in 1400, I guess. So, I mean, there's all these different books that men have written, and they're all full of contradictions, and they're all full of factually false statements about science and history. And worse than that, they all promote immoral acts that we can objectively judge to be immoral, because we know that there's no reason to not unnecessarily cause harm and suffering. We know, everybody knows, that if you're causing harm and suffering unnecessarily, that's immoral, period. Well, that's an objective standard.
So I would agree with that, but I don't think we can determine what exactly that means. So, like, we can't know exactly what effect things will have now, that have in the future, or the whole derivation of someone making an act, and if that act is actually warranted given a certain circumstance of that certain person's biology and their mental functioning at that given time. Like, everything that goes into it it's complex, just like our world has been created through cause and effect to where it is now and where it will be. And it's just this utter complexity of contradictions and then compilations and deteriorations that occur. And so we see, I guess what I was saying is that God wouldn't necessarily be an intervening force so much as when we reach a commonality, God would be that commonality of understanding when we can come to an actual truth that's transcendent across all things. Like, when we can actually come in line and work symbiotically, that sort of a symbiosis and growth is more what God would be us reaching. And when we fail to reach that and end up actually, acting in a negative manner, which wastes our own energy, lowers our own value, and then also could be a detriment to society. Because what you can actually see is that when people work together in symbiosis, and when they're collaborating, and when they're able to compound that growth. And so that idea is you actually maximize yourself. It's in your self-interest to act in accordance with your environment. And that environment, when you're moving through time, will move in a certain direction. And that I think seems to makes sense to me from a logical perspective. And I think that you could potentially interpret the Bible that way. And I guess what I'm saying is, like, the Bible, are you looking at the Bible as a literal word of God? Or are you looking at the Bible as a book that shows anthropology that reflects a certain truth about the way that society can be carried out, and how it interprets fact and truth? I mean, I guess I don't know, but
so my understanding is, and this is reading the opinions of other people more learned than I. There's what I've read is that there's a number of scholars who basically they all understand that Judaism was formed out of a composite of different belief systems, and one of the statements that I remember reading was that Zoroastrianism contributed more to Judaism than any of the other basis influences. And so rabbinic Judaism is a very different thing than what Judaism was prior to that. And they taught me that directly, and I took a college course on it that was being taught by a Methodist minister, believe it or not. and he based much of his class on the works of Bart Ehrman, which is also funny because Ehrman is an atheist. But they're talking about how Judaism came into existence, the different inspirations from other religions and everything that developed that. And then talking to Jews, you see how Christianity added and heavily embellished and altered and reinterpreted and revisioned their Bible. And so, the Christians will talk about how Jesus fulfilled all of these prophecies or whatever. And then you talk to the Jews, and the Jews are saying, here's our list of prophecies that are in the Old Testament. Jesus fulfilled none of them, not one. So, or at least none of the important ones. Yes, he was Jewish. and that's it. That's the only thing he fulfilled. And then Islam is based on a very early and unorthodox version of Christianity, because there were all versions of Christianity were unorthodox at one point when they're all being put together. And there were many different versions of Christianity in the beginning until they finally decided to canonize. And then as soon as they canonized, there's a great schism. And now you have Catholics versus Orthodox going off in their different directions. And then they continue sharding into thousands or tens of thousands of different denominations after that. So Islam argues that Christianity came in, and they agree with the Jews on this, that Christianity came in and rewrote and reinterpreted and corrupted what the Jews had already corrupted, or the Christians have corrupted it again. And then the Christians agree with the Jews that Islam comes in and corrupts it again. So in the Muslim version, Jesus exists, Jesus is a prophet, but Jesus never died. I mean, he's immortal. He never died. He wasn't crucified. He lives today, according
is
to...
that where, sorry, is that where it come from? I don't remember who said it, but someone claimed that according to the Jews, I think it was, Jesus was, he was hung on the cross. Someone switched him with, or he was switched with someone else. He didn't really get hung on the cross.
Yeah,
there was this kind of conspiracy theory going on there.
Yeah, there's a couple of discrepancies. If you read Luke, and you contrast that with Josephus Bar Matthias, or Joseph of who is being associated with Joseph of Arimathea, there's I know at least one scholar who says that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Bar Matthias, or also known as Josephus Flavius. If you compare Josephus to Luke, you realize that they're talking about the same thing from two different angles. They've just changed the names ever so slightly, and so it does seem that everything's written from different perspectives. And what Josephus was talking about was having found three of his friends up on crosses, and so he runs not to Pilate but to Titus, and has his friends taken down, and then two of them died and one lived. Or I'm getting it back. No, two of them lived and one of them died. So one of them died on the cross, and he's very upset about this. And the only record that they have of a Jesus being killed was one that was stoned to death rather than being crucified. And now, of course, Josephus talked about 19 different people with the name Jesus.
Oi.
And what?
Yeah. I forgot to mute myself. I was surprised. 19.
Yeah, 19 different Jesuses. And some of them Christians have claimed is their Jesus, even though they lived decades too late, and we know something about them to know that they're not that guy. I mean, like specifically Jesus ben Ananias and Jesus of Damnius were both claimed by Christians that's historic proof of their Jesus. But that's a different character who lived at a different time, had a different yes, Jesus of Damnius had a brother named James. But lots of people had a brother named James, and there's a hell of a lot of Jesuses at that time. So just because he was Jesus the Anointed doesn't mean he was the Anointed.
Well, I guess to that, I mean, I think Islam is interesting in that they do reference the gospel and the Torah, and they say that they were corrupted by the Jews and the Christians. I do think that given Christianity, if you take it in 600 years about when Muhammad comes along, you've got 600 years of this church, which has been initially started out relatively fragmented with having, I mean, you did have the splits. You had the Arians, you had the Gnostics, you had various different sects of it. You had the Christian church, which is coming up into existence. You have this collection of popes that comes through and has their opinions on things. And then you have the interplay of politics when you get with Charlemagne in there, and you have Constantinople, and yeah, there's very wide-ranging, nebulous sort of structure there. But you do see there are commonalities, but there are some major flaws in terms of the actual interpretation of the scripture. Which one of them would be the Arian philosophy that there's three gods, and that idea that there's three, that you're worshiping three beings, is a major issue. For instance, if you were to believe in, as a Muslim, that's a major issue. If Christians took out of Jesus that there's three gods, that's a major issue there in translation. Christians took out that Mary was resurrected as well as born without complete sin, and that Mary was somehow this figure in the Trinity and all this, and that Mary was not just a human. That is not the message. So, like, it seems to me some of the places in the Quran, they're trying to correct things, and I would guess, and I think it would be better to talk to someone who's a Muslim about this, in terms of more detail on it. But I would guess that they'll find a lot of places when it goes through what the Old Testament and New Testament say, that they'll provide more context to they'll provide and address questions on some of these sect issues between interpretations. But I don't know. I think that if you can find the commonality between the three, and you can see how that trajectory influences history, there may be a degree of truth to it. And if you can then aggregate that with Buddhism and Hinduism, and also notice the significant differences in what it says about their culture and what it says about their way of perceiving their personal morality, I think that religion overall, it's more important to understand the common thread that allows people to aggregate, and actually then when you're talking to them, understand their thought process and logic out of that, and that'll allow us to actually collaborate, and that'll allow us to maximize all of our profits. And so I guess that I know that I'm kind of being a bit like, I may be going off a bit on a tangent, so I'll kind of wrap it there, but like for now. But I just kind of wanted to get out the position that from a Christian perspective, you should start with the Bible as truth. And then, yes, everyone may have their interpretation of it. And I'm not here to correct or make assumptions on anyone's interpretation of it, or assert that I have the Christian perspective or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think that it's important to not necessarily negate religion I think that it's hard to say, because it's important not to just dismiss religion as something that can't be helpful, because I think that understanding the immense value in understanding social perception of religion is really, really important.
I was told that the Bible was the word of God, and then it was the absolute truth, and that God is love and God is wisdom and all of that. So, I mean, if I read the Bible, I'm going to get direct firsthand accounts of wisdom and knowledge, and ultimate wisdom and knowledge. And
yeah,
you don't have to read very far into it before you realize there ain't no wisdom in this book. And there certainly isn't any knowledge in this book, and there's no truth in it either. That's a problem, because when you think that it's absolute truth, then the first 19 things you find that you know are factually false are going to dissuade you from that interpretation, and that's what causes a lot of people to reject this. I mean, if you started out before the Bible, like 700 years before the Bible, and you read the Avestas of Zarathustra, I could maybe see that, because it's easier to interpret those, especially in the context of that time, than it is in this time to read the Bible and think that it's truth.
Yeah, especially in respect to the whole thing about the Christian God being a loving God. I mean, how can a loving God keep, the Old Testament, keep ordering, playing favorites, and then order his favorites to kill other people left, right, and center?
Yeah, it's not just the Old Testament God. I mean, Jesus is just Jesus.
No, but I think it was more prevalent, wasn't it? Wasn't it more killing in the Old Testament than the
Yeah,
New
they're
One?
more killing, but what Jesus demands is no more defensible. You know, I mean, he's
Oh
going
yeah, I didn't come to bring peace. I came with a sword.
and it's
Yeah.
worse than just that. You're going to be damned to eternal hellfire if you don't believe. And this is the message that Islam carries. And by the way, Rise, if you were interested in those, you said if you'd be better to talk to Muslim about this. I do like a bi-monthly show where and I'll be doing it this time tomorrow. I
Okay.
Quran lessons for the infidel. And so I talked to a panel of people who were raised in Islam and speak Arabic, and we go through different surahs. Now, I'll read first my interpretation of that surah, and then I have a panel of people who were raised in that environment, know the local traditions, and who will explain what I got right or wrong in that.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, that it's interesting to talk to, like, that's like, I like to talk to people directly that like are of that religion, or that of different interpretations of it, because they tend to and that actually know what they're talking about and aren't just like, oh, I just believe because I believe it's there. I just have faith. I just have faith. I like, look, there are people that also have the logical backing for it, that I've tried to derive what could be a logical backing for it for my own interpretation. But what I've found is that, just like anything, I can't speak to anything to an absolute certainty. And I mean, I think that I guess, yeah, you're right. If you were to just look at this as something where God is an active player in this, like he's an active person figure in this Bible, like the Jews perceived of him, and like Christians still may, but I think it's more about like that is an added truth too. People start out with having these certain conceptions of what is doing things in their world, and as opposed to looking at the Old Testament as something where it, like I said, is an anthropology. It's showing the character of a group of people moving through time that has gone through hardships. And so you look at their positioning and their development culturally and scientifically, and their ability to protect themselves and why it was that way. I think it can show you how cultures self-develop in terms of understanding. And that's that. Like, I just more try to look at it that way, looking at it as a historical piece of supportive evidence. Like you would look at for you, like maybe if you look at like the Odyssey or the Iliad, like there's not necessarily proof it happened, but it can tell you a heck of a lot about human nature and about perspective and all of that. So I think there's great value in learning these things and understanding just understanding these really full concepts of, or full examples of concepts.
now there I agree with you completely. I read the Bhagavad Gita and the Quran, and well, not so much the Quran, but the Bible definitely the same way I would read the Odyssey. It's in the same context for me. There is value of it as far as ancient literature, as in terms of mythology. The value of the literature as mythology is certainly there, but that's it. Everything about morality is right out the window.
I think that any interpretation in that book of morality that was made in terms of law, as opposed to anything that was, because all those laws that were in the Old Testament, those were written by priests. Most of them were all written by priests and by rabbis and by church higher ups. And who knows, when they did those laws that get into a given context, how did that affect their society? How influential was it to make these impacts on their society? How influential is religion when you have a group of people about this size? Like, how would you treat your society in this circumstance? And so I guess the question is more taking it second level on the Bible, as opposed to trying to say, okay, so this does this in Leviticus. You can't eat meat. You can't tie your shoes this way. I don't even know, but they have so many little tiny minutia. But that's like,
here's a big one for you. Here's a big one. The 10 Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
This one is huge for me because it's not. It's one of the things I'm like, have people read the book? I mean, because there are, depending on how you interpret it, there are either 11 or 14 commandments just in Exodus 20. And the list continues in Exodus 21, 22, and you to finally get to where Moses comes back down, I think in Exodus 23, maybe 24, where he comes down with the commandments and destroys them. And then in Exodus 34, he has to come back with a whole new set, and they're completely different. And this time, for the first time, they're called the 10. And God goes through the list of what the 10 are, and they are not the same 10 that people see in courthouses. So there's never a point the first set, what people call the 10 commandments, those are just the first 10 of a long list, of a list that includes racist statements, of that are ethnocentric statements that are justifying slavery. There's a long list of commandments. And
so when we hear that, oh yeah, the slaves are to come from the heathens around you, from them you might buy slaves. That's part of the commandments.
And you can beat your slave as savagely as you want to, as long as you don't knock out his eye or kill him. He has to be able to get up from the beating within a couple of days.
Yeah, I actually talked to a theist about that a while ago, and he said that, oh yeah, that's like a misinterpretation. It isn't that you can beat your slave all you want and then you have no punishment. Supposedly, according to him, it was that you have to think of it like tooth for tooth. If you beat your slave and they don't die, you won't get a death sentence.
One of the other things is how long can you keep your slave, and what loophole can you use to keep your slave forever?
That's
and then Jews get special rules, not just with slavery, but also with like there's one of the commandments. This is one of the commandments that you can't charge interest on a loan to another Jew.
You can't do it.
This was a message intended for all people at all times. When it casts a value of people in how many sheep or shekels they're worth. And a woman, of course, is half price of a man.
Well,
these are the commandments. This is the ultimate guide to morality, so we are told.
I think that but see, look at what this shows you. This is an interpretation of these people. This is what this means. This is what we're seeing this as. This is what we're going to contextualize what this is and put it in our culture, which has slavery, which has all this stuff. And we see it to be right because everywhere else has it around us, and it's always been done. And like all of these laws, I think, reflect how they interpreted God. But always there will be a flaw in whatever system you try and create.
So what then is the message?
The message is that, I guess the message is that when you can take ideas and understandings about how things are true and you can correlate them, you'll create societies. Like when you have people that are able to come together in a common thought or understanding, they'll be able to grow that thought and understanding. And so like over time, we've seen knowledge develop, technology develop, stuff like that. We've seen communication increase, just this adaptation. That's what it is. That's what it's referring to, is that you'll see, though, when you're going against what that overarching is, regardless of whether or not you think it's God, whether you think it's Jesus, whether you think it's whatever you think it is, if you innately are following a path that is against how the world's evolving, you're not going to do too well. You're going to end up kind of crumbling and you're going to stagnate. And whenever we try to put circumstances in place where we're assuming a stagnant country and we're going to put all these laws down, and then things change over 5 years and we're like, wait, the laws are now they don't work anymore. Like we think that we get it, but we never get it. There's always going to be change, and we have to be changing with that around us and growing and to understand the concept. I'm not sure. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. I don't think I could add anything more, except that I think that my interpretation of the Bible seems to be quite opposite of yours, not just different.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's nothing the Bible says that doesn't contradict the interpretation that you just gave. So I think we're probably going to be at an impasse there. I'm welcome to hear anybody else's thoughts on the matter, but we've been at this for a while, and so.
So I was kind of wondering, and again, my apologies for kind of sidetracking with the dog earlier. It's just this guy was basically saying that he had been following the videos, just waiting for an update for how, for how that was going. But I still had those questions. If you got the time.
Okay. All right. Is everybody good? Or do you have any closing statements? Anyone?
I just did want to clarify. Like, my position is not that what I was saying about everything, like in terms of that is an interpretation exactly, was Christianity was definitely how the Bible should be interpreted, was the correct interpretation. What I was saying is that I've conceptualized it this way. I like to discuss that and understand where I may be wrong or right on it. And I know that there are that for to get a more Christian perspective, and that to go by the book on Christianity, it would require more than the assumptions I was making for a lot of people's beliefs. So just want to say that.
Okay. And if you'd like, I'll send you a link to the thing we're doing tomorrow on Quran lessons, and you can let me know if you're interested in participating in that.
Yeah,
right.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any closing comments before I shut it down?
I mean, I suppose it's probably just like a little bit of maybe like a topic change, but maybe it could just be for another time. But like say like like how most people will hold to like epistemological solipsism, the basic idea that you can't know of anything outside of your mind. If once you grant that, okay, that means really the nature of reality is unknown. You could be in the Matrix, you could be this, you could be that, which means a literal interpretation of the Bible could actually be the truth, because you don't know the nature of reality. You just don't know.
If you assume solipsism, the Bible's still wrong.
No, what I'm saying is, if you could be a brain in a vat, you can't talk about what's right or wrong. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, you can, because if everything is just an illusion, then those things in the Bible didn't really happen, and the Bible is just representing something in that case. So
I think you missed.
I would advise that David Hume wrote quite a bit about this, and he was talking about how if we don't have any fact to go on, then we have to assume that there is other minds besides ourselves, and that there is a reality that is independent of us, and we have no choice in that. We absolutely have to assume that, because there's literally madness to do anything else. It is not possible to do anything or achieve anything or to even be if we don't make this assumption. He says we're forced to do this the same way an animal would, the same way a baby would. We have to assume the reality of reality, but that's it. And the Bible is talking about where reality came from. So if there's no reality, then the Bible's still wrong.
No, that's a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. It's really to do with the nature of reality, right? So what I'm saying is, you might interpret reality how you think it is, but in in actual reality, you may be, for example, you could be a brain in a vat. I'm not saying you are. I'm not saying that. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you don't know you're not, then all the facts that you have basically are blind faith. You take them on faith.
No, it's not faith. Faith is when you believe something that you don't have evidence for, and that all of the evidence indicates that reality is real. And we have Occam's razor and we have Hitchens' razor. So we have logical reasons, logical evidence, if you will, that also indicate that reality is real. And we can't use solipsism as a defense of the Bible, because the Bible's still wrong. Even if we are brains in vats, then the Bible, none of those things really happen, because there's no reality for them to happen in.
Yeah, but I'm not saying reality doesn't exist, right? And I'm not saying reality is not real, because that's like more of what do you call it? It's a tautological. What I'm saying is, you don't actually, no offense, but like, because of things like solipsism, certain problems like that, you can't know the nature of reality in an ultimate sense. For all you know, just everything that you think you know is wrong.
Well,
so it just means
atheists don't make claims about ultimate knowledge anyway.
So it's all faith. Atheism is based on blind faith. Like,
it's not faith, and it damn sure isn't blind faith. When you follow what the evidence indicates, and that's it. And you don't assume things that are not indicated. And I'm not starting out with the assumption that there's a God. I'm not starting out with the assumption that the Bible is truth. Right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We'll see. I'm not going to be convinced of something until I'm convinced of it. There has to be evidence to imply that that is the case. And it has, whether I want to believe that or not is irrelevant. I believe things that when I say believe, I mean in a different context than believers do. When I say believe in something, it means that this is what I think is most likely true or closest to the truth, because I don't believe in too many absolutes. I'm even hesitant to say whether there are. I can say that within the framework of reality, we can be absolutely certain that there was never a global flood of Noah's Ark. That we can be absolutely certain of that. But that's assuming that the reality exists, right? Which we have no reason to assume it doesn't. It violates all these razors to assume that it doesn't, and it would render everything moot, including the Bible that you're trying to defend. So there's no reason to go there. It may be logically defensible, but it does. But solipsism doesn't provide anything. All it is an excuse to go on believing something that you know is not really true, and that's faith.
I mean, I'm not positing solipsism from my framework. I'm saying it's something that naturally follows from a, like sort of a naturalistic, nihilistic, solipsistic, atheistic kind of framework, right? That is basically, it does boil down to that.
Atheism, why would you say it's nihilist and solipsist?
I've never heard of or met or talked to an atheist who believes in solipsism.
Yeah.
No. Where did he get that from?
Epistemological solipsism, isn't it? It's basically the belief that you can't know with any kind of certainty that anything outside of your mind exists, which most atheists will admit, yeah, I can't know.
But we have to. It's not just obligatory. It's impossible not to. I mean, it's not even possible not to make the basic assumption that there is an independent reality. We can't.
That's assumption.
But if if impossible were, then correct, it would be impossible not to not making, you know what I mean?
But it's an assumption. Still,
assumption.
So you're saying your defense? I can't believe this is a defense.
Yes.
Is you're saying that it's an assumption? That's not a defense.
Because you're saying that I make an assumption, so I have to exist. Then if you didn't exist, you wouldn't actually be making the assumption that you're saying you're making now, even though it gets into like ridiculousness.
I know a solipsist who argues that he does not exist.
Yeah,
how can he argue he doesn't?
The thing is, when atheists say, "Oh yeah, we don't make appeals to absolute certainty," that has nothing to do with faith. It has to do with the acknowledgement that humans are fallible. There could always be something we don't know that we don't know, and we can never say that there isn't, because we wouldn't know it if it were.
Right. So instead of saying that you've disproved something just by the fact that it's not supported, it's not supported, and then you don't need to disprove it, because an unsupported assertion has no more credence than a claim that has been proven wrong. They both have zero credence.
Well, credence from our perspective. Because I think that's important to recognize. And science over time has developed in terms of the knowledge that we have of it and our understanding. So from our perspective, there may not be credence, but it's important to note to always be open-minded to science showing us things that will have us revolutionize our understanding, because that is something that's happened continuously.
Yeah.
And I know,
I would agree with that completely.
But and I'm sorry to nag here. It's okay if I get over to the questions now? Before you
have questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I have like 3 short ones and a couple of ones that I wrote. It's a bit more elaborate. Is it okay if I start with the small ones?
Sure.
Okay. So these questions have been asked by theists on the Real Ponty server. If you lack a belief in God, what is it within your framework that is ultimate and ties everything together?
Do I need something that's ultimate? I don't understand the question.
Well, sorry, I don't think you need anything ultimate either. But supposedly you do need. Everyone believes something in something that's ultimate and foundational, supposedly. I don't know if that's true.
It's real.
So yeah, I think what he's saying is you don't have a conception where you can ground or prove that you're using one. You can prove existence and prove the logical patterns of things happening.
Yeah,
you can't say it is. Yeah.
We don't have a choice to question the assumption of whether reality is real, then it's a fair assessment that reality is real. That is the model that works. Science has to work with the model that works, and the model that reality is real is the one that works.
All right, so you're basing it off of.
Yeah.
I have a question though. But when we say reality is real, I mean, you don't mean that in the tautological sense, right? I think you're implying, I guess, sort of naturalism again. In other words, reality is, testable, repeatable, and there is nothing that would transcend
naturalism. I don't think you mean what some other people mean by that. So, what do you think implying naturalism means?
I suppose I'm probably talking about, is it methodological naturalism? Basically there is no supernatural, that kind of thing.
Methodological naturalism is contrasted by philosophical naturalism, in that philosophical naturalism states that the supernatural doesn't exist, and methodological naturalism simply says that we can't investigate the supernatural, even on the assumption that it does exist.
Well, yeah, I think
you put it another way. Methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism means that all assertions have to be based on prior evidence, and they have to be testable. So we can't state the truth of anything if we can't show that there's a truth of it.
Right. Well, how would you show this? How would you show the truth of that? You think, and I suppose now we're getting to philosophy. I suppose it's really a different
science. It's literally the scientific method. That science is not allowed to make assertions. Scientists are not allowed in the capacity of science. They're not allowed to make assertions that are not backed by evidence. Faith does. That's what faith is, making assertions that are not backed by evidence. But science has to work exactly opposite of faith, because you have to be able to show that there's a there, or we've nothing to talk about.
I suppose I'm just still trying to get my head around it though. So when you say like reality is real, are you saying reality is, basically naturalistic or testable, that kind of thing?
I'm saying that there is a mind-independent reality. That this is not an illusion. I am not a figment of some god's imagination. I'm not in the Matrix. This is not an illusion. That if I see footprints on the beach, it doesn't mean that a computer has programmed me to see footprints on the beach. It means that somebody walked on the beach. It means that there is a beach and somebody walked on it. Even if I wasn't there to see it, I know that it happened.
But all of that is your assumption, right? I'm not saying you're wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. That was your anti-solipsistic assumption.
I think there's a distinction to be made between a mere assumption and an inference.
Yeah. Well, no, Aaron called it an assumption. He said he assumes that reality is real, and he assumes that the mind.
They don't have a choice, and neither do you.
Yeah, and by assumption, I think you meant inference.
I'm not arguing for solipsism. I'm just saying that it flows from atheism, but then straight out the gate you deny it. Straight out the gate. Within the atheistic framework, no one can know of anything outside of their mind, as far as I know, right?
Then it seems like you don't know what the atheist framework is, mate, because the atheist framework doesn't say anything about what you can or can't know outside your own head.
Epistemologically, you start with yourself.
Books, that's knowledge that's outside my mind. We have recordings of knowledge.
That could be in your mind. If you really think about it, you can't prove it's not.
But again, I don't have a choice but to accept that there is a mind-independent reality and that other minds exist outside my own. That you are not a figment of my imagination, because that's one of Catholicism is that everybody, you are a figment of my imagination, and I know one who argues that he is a figment of somebody else's imagination.
Yeah, I'm with you. I agree with your conclusion that that you are real, and you're not part of my mind.
There's no reason to discuss this. We have no choice. It is literally madness to try to take the solipsist position. You can't achieve anything that way. Literally cannot achieve anything at all. Not even your own existence.
But that is basically the position that that you're assuming is false, which I'm saying you're right. Your conclusion that it's false is correct.
The model that works. For you, the model that works. But for you, reality is real. That it's not an illusion.
Yeah, which is an assumption.
Yeah.
That's an assumption.
So let me put it another way. The way that we see things, we know how the rods and cones, we know that how light refracts and reflects inside of our eye. We have very complicated explanations for how vision works. We have very complicated explanations for how our ears work, how the inner ear works, how these tiny hairs and all these vibrations in the sinus and all of that, how all of that works. But there are solipsists who will say, and I don't know if solipsist is the right word, but there's other people that are arguing for this position that all these complicated things that we can show to be true are all false because we are just brains in vats or figments of imagination. We're all just a dream of Brahma. God is asleep and he dreamt us all into being. And when he wakes up, we will all cease to exist. And everything we think we know is wrong, including these demonstrably accurate explanations for how hearing and all this work, because they want to argue that there's no such thing as an atom, that there's no kind of material at all, that everything is literally imaginary. I can't believe that. Yeah, I don't. It's an assumption that everything is not imaginary.
Sure, but once you grant that it's an assumption, once you grant it's an assumption, once you grant that yes, it is an assumption that reality is real, you're admitting that every single fact that you hold to is held on basically faith because it's an assumption.
No, once again, no. We have the evidence that indicates that this is true. We have science going with the model that works. We have the model that works that indicates that it is true. Faith is believing something that is not evidently true. I don't have that position. I'm an epistivist. That means somebody who denounces faith. Faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have. It is exclusively auto-deceptive. It cannot lead you to truth. So any belief that requires faith should be rejected for that reason. And I hate, absolutely hate, when every biblical literalist wants to try to project their own faults onto me because I will not share it. I do not believe anything on faith. I won't, because faith is lying to yourself until you believe it.
I mean, I get where you're coming from. I just feel like you say, like once you assume reality is real and you assume that you know the nature of reality,
because you don't have any choice. That's the one.
It just means that you don't. You're right about it.
You assume you don't even have a choice in it, and if you don't have a choice in it, then how can you criticize me for it?
Yeah, Faith, I would very much like you to kind of round this off because I still have a few questions left. So just one out.
Cool.
Are you done, or is there something you would like to add before I continue?
No, that's fine. It's fine. Like I say, it's almost a subject change anyway, because we're talking more science and religion and stuff as opposed to, theology. Philosophy. Anyway.
Okay. Okay. So, Aaron, theists I talk to tend to say that the Holy Trinity is, three in essence and three in being. What do you think about the claim that the Trinity does posit a solution to the problem of the one and the many?
The Trinity was invented based on the prior idea of the Hindu Trimurti, where you had Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu all as one unified Godhead. But each of these characters were their own being. They had their own independent lives. They had wives and so forth. But they were working like at a governmental Godhead, the head of God, these three beings. And so you have the Christian addition of Christ into the theology as well as like the Holy Ghost. So you had these like different aspects. Some of it taken from Zoroastrianism, some of it taken from Hellenism, and of course, most of it taken from Judaism. And the issue they had and why they had to create Jesus as being the triune God, where God is God, where Jesus is his own Father, and Jesus prays to himself, saying, "Hi, you, it's me, you." Right? The reason they have that contradiction is because Jesus represents a contradiction of the very first commandment, that thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then Jesus comes along and says, no one comes to the Father but through me. And so the Christians were like, well, how do we reconcile this contradiction? I know, Jesus is God.
Yeah, and all the while, of course, when you say that God is one in essence and three in being, I don't think really that solves anything. It just makes it look like God has more in common with those green little men from Toy Story than it does with us.
Yeah, and it's not in the Bible either. That's another one of those Christian legends, like we mentioned before about, who the serpent is and all that. There's a lot of things that Christians traditionally believe that aren't in there. So the Bible doesn't describe the Trinity. Instead, what it does is that every time Jesus refers to God, he describes God as being someone else, somewhere else, who knows things he doesn't know, which means he's not the same character, and can do things that Jesus can't do. And then you have that one scene in Matthew where God shows up as a cloud, and this is Jehovah now. This is God the Father, the actual God, and he introduces Jesus to the Jews. And this is when they're taking the elements of the old story of John the Baptist and they're reappropriating the legend of John the Baptist and then his followers unto Jesus. So they want to make John the Baptist followers Christian followers. So they like appropriated the story and give and switch all the credit over to Jesus. The Muslims did the same thing. But God says, here is my son, Jesus, in whom I'm very proud. So God is talking about Jesus while Jesus is there and talking about Jesus in the third person. And then the Holy Ghost shows up, who's the other third of the same Trinity, and leads Jesus off to someplace Jesus didn't know. None of this would be possible if Jesus is an avatar of God, or literally God in the flesh. Now, we know what that concept is like, because when you read the Bhagavad Gita, that's exactly how Krishna describes himself, that he is the supreme personality of the Godhead, that all the gods emanate from him, and that he himself personally, not God somewhere, not God in heaven, not our Father who is in heaven. Krishna says, I created the universe. Me. I'm the guy. I did everything. So it's really hard to read the Bhagavad Gita and then see anything special in Jesus after that. And so somebody will say, well, Jesus says at one point, he says that me and the Father are one. Yeah, he does. And then later in John, he's praying to himself. No, he's not. He's praying to somebody else, asking if his disciples, asking God, who's not asking himself, he's asking someone else, if his disciples can be made one with God, just as Jesus is one with God, which means you can be born already and be a mortal human and then become one with God. So clearly, Jesus is not one with God in the same sense that the Christian followers say that Jesus is one with God, because that interpretation isn't possible.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So
Yeah,
closing statements. I mean, if anybody wants to take this up again on a different topic, I'm completely down with that. But we've been really long on this one.
When I say really long on this topic, just make sure I'm on the same page. When I say been really long on this one, what do you mean?
We've been on camera for 2 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Longer than that, actually.
Oh, okay. Yes. Sorry. Okay, I'm gonna try to rush through the rest though.
Okay.
Okay, so if this question is kind of vague and you can't really give an answer, we can just skip it, because the guy who asked it, Darth Dawkins, I asked him to elaborate and write this down, and he wouldn't. So he wanted me to ask.
Seriously, he's just a professional troll.
He actually wanted me to ask you if I could arrange or at least request you to talk to him.
Why?
I don't know. He wants to crush you. Crush your worldview, I suppose.
I can't take him seriously. He can't believe his own nonsense. It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, he wanted me to ask you in any case that since atheism is a universal negative, then how can you exactly?
Have you noticed that all of his arguments begin with a false assertion, a statement of falsity, which he just assumes is the case. Every one of his challenges are always fallacious. That's why I say he can't take himself seriously.
Yeah. So, yeah. Basically, since atheism is a universal negative, then how can you have it universal in a godless world?
Stupid question, self-defeating.
Yeah, we can skip it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question that was asked is, okay, never mind. We can skip this too, because that was basically the first question, I realized.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the kind of the three question that I had, and these are kind of longer, because I wrote them down as small paragraphs. So I'm just gonna take them one by one. It's three of them. Let's see. Theists often ask me why they should accept atheism as a lack of belief in God, when, according to philosophical and academic literature, it's been defined as a denial of God. And when I try to take the Matilhanti approach, namely to remind them that words don't have inherent meanings, they have usages, and those usages change over time, they will often be very dismissive and say that historically, atheism as a concept have referred to a positive claim, and they will and that there are indeed even today atheist philosophers, both past and present, that agrees with the definition that that atheism is a denial of God, and claim that internet atheists are
wrong. All of that is wrong. The first use of the word ethos, which was by the Greeks, was we're describing Christians actually as lacking theism, that they had no theism. So they're worshiping a guy that's just a guy who was supposedly killed by the Romans just, like a generation earlier. And so they don't have the thousands of years of theology that the Greeks and the Romans had. So this was all from the beginning. It was talking about a lack. It's a lack of belief. That's the ultimate question. Do you believe or don't you believe? So when you go to the Christian pearly gates, supposedly, right, you're going to be asked this question. Did you believe? Did you not believe? So it's a yes or no question. Yes, okay, then all your sins can be forgiven. No, you're going to hell. You can't get the agnostic up there who says, well, I didn't believe there was a God, but I didn't believe there was not a God either. Okay, well, you're stamped did not believe, go to hell. That's what it is. That's all it is. And that's all it ever was. And if you look at decades before Huxley came up with his bullshit word agnosticism, atheism was already in the dictionaries as lacking a belief.
Okay. I'm just a bit confused.
It's basically the position that the believer is saying things they don't really know. It's like when you make up statistics just out of your head. 68.5% of people just make up their own statistics. Yeah, that's what you're doing. You don't know what you're talking about. That's the atheist position, is that the theist doesn't know what they're talking about.
Right. Yeah, I just got a bit confused because they keep saying to me that according to philosophical and academic literature, I'm not sure.
Even Stanford, what is it? The Encyclopedia of Philosophy admits that there are two equally valid definitions, and one of them being the simple lack of belief in a God. Every reference, including that one, says that there are two definitions. One is lacking a belief, and then a subset of that are those who believe that there is not a God, because obviously the people who believe that there is not a God are a subset of the people who don't believe that there is a God.
Right. Yeah. I kind of tried to there is this thing on Google, like a picture you can find where it kind of separates people into four categories. It's like Gnostic atheist, Gnostic theist, agnostic atheist, agnostic.
Yeah, I need to get to your other questions because I've got something else I've got to get to.
Yeah, I apologize. Let's see. Yeah, so I was talking to another theist a while back, and we were talking about what I call the apparent megalomania of God in subjecting humans to His wrath if they don't worship. Yeah, sorry, if they don't worship Him. Mm-hmm. And he replied that, well, we live in God's world, and rejecting God's seems like it's a very ungrateful thing to do since He put us there. Besides, if you own a piece of land and you had poachers all over the place who laughed and mocked you when you told them to stop, hunting illegally, what would you do? What do you think of that analogy?
You have somebody, you've imprisoned a person on your piece of territory, your island, if you will. You've imprisoned this person and you impose these immoral laws on them, and they're supposed to show you respect, not just respect. They're supposed to bow down and kiss your ass and tell you how great you are because you're so insecure. You're the ultimate power in the universe, but you're so insecure that you need these weaker beings to tell you how great you are because you don't know. Any being worthy of worship would not want to be worshipped.
That sounds about right.
And the next question?
Yeah, the last one. So in the past, I've spoken to a number of theists who find that atheists tend to be, needlessly hostile towards them, and feel that they kind of tend to underestimate the virtues of organized religion in general. So out of interest, despite whatever misgivings we might have about the content and consequences of belief held on faith, particularly when religious dogma and doctrines are taken too far. Do you think that the communities established within organized religion can provide a viable support system for individual members of that community in terms of giving them a sense of belonging and fellowship? Or do you think that the cons negate or otherwise undermine the pros?
Yeah, that negates itself, because the most fundamental human right is freedom of thought. But every religion is a belief system, a faith-based belief system, where you are told to believe what you're told to believe simply because you're told to believe it, and you'd better believe it no matter what, because you're given the false promise of an impossible reward that they won't have to pay you because you need to be dead in order to collect it. And they counterbalance that with, the stick and the carrot. They counterbalance that with the threat of a fate worse than death if you don't believe. So you have prohibited beliefs and required beliefs. You do not have free thought. And while they're talking about how rude we are because they're lying to us, they're claiming to know things they don't know, which is a lie, and they're citing facts that are not facts, which is a lie. And then everything else that they do, everything else religion does is frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies, and that's about it. And if you don't believe them, that's what is it? If you were religious, and then you decide, you know what, I don't believe this anymore, that's apostasy. That's a death sentence. And if you question the interpretation and think, you know what, I think it's more like this, but if that violates dogma, you don't get your own opinion. That's heresy. That's also punishable by death. And there are several countries, at least 7 countries in the world right now, where if I were in those countries and I would recognize, I would be put to death for not believing the bullshit of the local magistrate. Because that's how offsetting
sometimes I feel like
you're judged not for whether you're good or bad. You're judged on whether you believe, which in itself is immoral.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like theists tend to lie to themselves as well, because I've heard these really, really loud arguments between Christians and Muslims, and obviously, apparently, they don't believe in the same God. I mean, I grew up as a Protestant, but ever since I was like 8 years old, when I first heard about like Judaism and Islam, I compared them to the languages of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, because they are so similar that each of us could understand one another without trying to switch language if we just slow down. Yeah. And these 3 are so similar, and they all subscribe to the Abrahamic God. So it kind of feels like they are, and here I lack a better terminology for it, but it feels like it's like 3 sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Thank you for the questions. I want to thank everybody that you guys invited me to just have a chat, and I'm completely open to it, and I think it worked out very well. I'm sorry we went long, but thank you, everyone. I'm going to close this up. If you'd like to have a different one on it, maybe a specific topic and a time limit, I'm open to that too. All right, I'm going to close it. Thank you very much.
Right.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.